Right, well, I suppose we'll start there, and we'll deal with the serial non-tenor rappers later. Hello, everybody. Today, you'll be glad to hear we're not, well, this is tangentially related to GIS, but this is what I'm talking about today. It's not specifically GIS. This is more about the understanding of when your models of your data and your understanding of what the hell is going on just kind of breaks down completely. And it just so happens we've had happening just a few days ago, which is a perfect example of what I'm going to talk about today. So somehow Donald Trump won. People are very horrified by this. I doubt it's going to be as apocalyptically bad as people suggest. But against all odds, he managed to beat the ultimate establishment candidate and became President of the United States. And one of the big reasons why this is like such a huge deal is because it completely rewrites the rules. I think he's like one of the first ever, I think he might be the first ever president who wasn't previously a politician. And he was a complete anti-politician. Everything about him breaks the rules of how the political system in Washington works. And so we have no idea what the next 4 years are going to be like coming out of Washington. So this comes very neatly into what I'm going to be talking about today. It's one of my favourite subjects, something called Black Swan events. I'm sure I've mentioned this before. But we'll just quickly go through. So this is what we're going to be covering today. Just what the hell are they? And how do we define them? Can we break it down into like, can we taxonomize them, describe them, so that if you see one happening around you, you can recognize it? Who are the sorts of people who are vulnerable, and why are people particularly vulnerable to this? And is there any way to mitigate against them? Largely the answer is no, but we'll come to that in a bit. So, any guesses where this photo is from? No? No? Any guesses? Okay, so this is a battle site from the First World War known as Passchendaele. And Passchendaele was, I think when it comes to the offences that, there you go, couple ones down, there we go. Right, Simon? When it comes to the offences that the British troops and the Commonwealth troops took part in, we all think of the Somme as the one. I mean, the Somme was is still the largest loss of life for any UK military offensive. But Passchendaele was probably the most unpleasant. And if you look at all of the battlefronts in the First World War, like Verdun on the Somme, this one's probably up there. So what made Passchendaele so bad, so it happened in the later portion of the war, I think it was in 1917, I think it happened. What made it so unpleasant was the mud. So what happens is, if you're, remember though, a lot of these people were using high explosive rounds until later in the war. High explosive rounds are hitting the ground, and it's sending up huge clods of earth all over the place. And it tends to make wonderful aerated loose soil sitting on top of the battlefield. And in Passchendaele, it was during the later period of the year, so it was autumn had just hit. It started raining, and it was one of the rainiest autumns on record. And this created a thick mud. And this mud, it was just absolutely horrendous. There are stories of people getting sucked in and drowning in this mud. And people had to fight in this as well. And it completely broke a generation. Well, the World War I, the Great War, completely broke a generation. And just to describe how awful Passchendaele was, and the general unpleasantness that was the Western Front, here's a quote from, I think it was from a British sergeant. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the guy's name, but this is a quote of him describing what he saw, and this wasn't even on the front line. He goes, a party of A Company men passing up from the front line found a man bogged up into the knee. The united efforts of 4 of them, with rifles beneath his armpits, made not the slightest impression, and to dig, even if shovels had been available, would be impossible, for there was no foothold. Duty compelled them to move up the line, and when 2 days later they passed down that way, the wretched fellow was still there, but only his head was now visible, and he was stark, raving mad. And that poor guy was not the only person to suffer that fate. There's all kinds of stories, as I was saying, people being slowly sucked into that mud and dying. But every battlefront in the First World War had its own particular horrors. So why am I talking about this? Well, the Great War, World War I, changed everything. Before this happened, the world was a completely different it was a completely different place, as we'll find out in just a second. But its effects still linger with us today because it was so unexpected. It wasn't, everybody was expecting a war maybe at some point, but nobody realised exactly how horrific it would be. Nobody realised that the weapons, the industrialisation had changed the way that we could fight and the way that our infrastructure worked and the tax systems now work to allow people to create and wage total war. I'll describe that in a bit, but just keep that in mind, this idea that now that everybody in society can now fight. Even on the home front, you are now a target. But, more interestingly, it doesn't just end with World War I. There's this incredible cascade effect that we're still living with today. There's I forget which documentary I was watching, but he was effectively describing how the 20th century was just a giant argument over capital. Who controls capital? Is it the fascists, where you have an elite in control of capital? Is it the capitalists, where the private individual controls capital? Or is it the socialists, where the state controls capital as a proxy for the general population? But anyway, First World War up here, and the First World War, of course, directly leads to the Second World War, of course. But at the same time, there is this at least 3 gigantic empires which had been around for hundreds of years, all suddenly collapsed. We had the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was holding on by a thread, and of course these are the guys that really started it in the first place. You had the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, who they have been around for hundreds of years, and they were for most of like the last, I suppose, 500 years, the Ottoman Empire, most of European history is fending off the Ottoman Empire. You've got the Russian Revolution, the collapse of the Tsar and him eventually being executed. And from that, of course, you get the Soviets coming out there. But also at the same time, in the French trenches towards the last months of the war, something unpleasant stirs. And that was the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu killed 40 million people worldwide. The First World War, I believe, killed 27 million people. So the Spanish flu was like this horrendous second wave. And the cruel irony of the Spanish flu was that it tended to affect young and healthy people. The way it tended to kill people, it would invoke like this huge cytokine storm in your body, and a cytokine storm is like your body's last-ditch effort to release every single bit of your immune system to fight off whatever infection's there. The problem is it can overwhelm your body and kill you, and this is what tends to happen. Obviously, if you're young, you've got a better immune system, and so you were kind of betrayed by your own body. But of course, from the Second World War, we have the Manhattan Project, which ultimately gave us nuclear bombs, which of course have changed the way that world politics works forever. And we've also had the Cold War come out of it. And the Cold War was also a direct result of the Russian Revolution. We would have, without the Soviets to face off against America, the Cold War would have never happened. And then we get the internet, and the internet is directly birthed from the Cold War. It was birthed from this idea that if there was a gigantic nuclear exchange, you still needed to send a signal off to your off to other various military installations. So the idea was you use the existing phone network and it bounces it from exchange to exchange. And that was the internet. So without the Cold War, without nuclear bombs, there would be no internet. And of course, the other thing that comes from the Cold War and the eventual, because the Cold War is effectively World War III. It was a bunch of proxy wars across the planet who were fighting on behalf or were supported by the Soviets and the US. And of course, the ultimate result of that is the supporting of the the guys that eventually did September 11th. And of course, out from September 11th, after the war against terror, which can otherwise be an acronym of TWAT, we get ISIS. And all of that, we can look back to the logical conclusion from the First World War. So, it's pretty crazy to think that a single event in history, we're still living with the consequences because of this cascade effect. And you'll notice there's something in about all of these events here. Each of these events are also world-changing. Each of these events leaves a permanent stain on our collective history that means we never live the same again because of it. So why was the Great War so great? Well, it's not great as in it was awesome, it was great as in it was like, oh my god. But, so the three main, so first of all we've got the French Revolution. And I believe somebody once said, how did the French Revolution turn out? And they said, well, we're still finding out. But what the French Revolution allowed, so it wasn't so much of an issue in mainland Britain, but through much of Europe, the system of representation for countries only meant they could levy so much taxes, and because they could only levy so much taxes and have so much engagement with the population, that meant in times of war you kind of had to rely on local barons to raise the armies for you. But the French Revolution changed that. With a centralised bureaucracy in the French state and a much more efficient way of doing things, they suddenly were able to raise much larger amounts of taxes, therefore resources, and therefore food. But also, they managed to mobilise a huge portion of their society. So I think in the end, something like 1 in 20 people were in the front line in France in the First World War, and that was a direct result of the French Revolution. This ability for the nations to suddenly completely transform the way that they're able to mobilise their armies in numbers never seen before. Industrialisation has at this point changed everything. So if we boil down human history into, like, I suppose its most basic elements, only 3 instances of any node count, and that's the development of agriculture, it is industrialization and the development of the computer. Everything else is just a side note. So development of agriculture allows the production of the excess, production capacity, which allows people in your society to diversify, so you can create more food, and because we've got more food, we can feed somebody who doesn't necessarily have to make food anymore. Agriculture gives us the state, and the state eventually leads on after hundreds of years, thousands of years even, eventually leads on to industrialization, where we've now got machines to do the work for us. It multiplies our physical capability. And then we've got the invention of the computer, which finally allows us to delegate mental tasks to a machine, which is crazy, but there we go. And this is the thing that started it all. 1775, often considered in geology, this is considered to be a benchmark moment. This is the birth of the Anthropocene. There's this Newcomen's atmospheric engine, which would become the steam engine. That was the start of the Industrial Revolution there, and they used it to pump water out of a mining pool, and it increased the efficiency of the mine by 110% or something ridiculous. But the other thing that it allows, so industrialization also created a whole bunch of terrifying new weapons. And because the world is mostly colonial powers trying to grab some slice of land far off, the colonial powers never really faced each other. And because of that, a lot of the colonial powers are still fighting according to Napoleonic battle doctrine. And the Napoleonic battle doctrine was, you form a line, you walk towards your enemy and you shoot in this line. Well, they never considered that you're going to have to go up a line of guys with rifles, because rifles are exquisitely accurate in comparison to a musket. And this is one of the reasons why casualties in the First World War was so great, because you're now fighting, you're fighting with Napoleonic tactics against an armed force which is fighting with 20th century weapons. It was a slaughter, and this is why I think it was like in one of the first big battles of the First World War, the French lose 90,000 troops in one day in a single combat, because they advanced on the German positions in Napoleonic formations. Crazy. And then finally, we have this last thing to consider, is this the mindset, the way that society has changed, and the philosophy of all these countries. And this is attributed to a Roman philosopher, I forget his name. But he effectively said, and this is echoed down through the ages, where he says, the strong do what they must, and the weak must endure. And he effectively said, the strong nations in the world must compete with the other strong nations to ensure that they don't get screwed over by their enemies. And if you're not a strong nation, well, you just have to kind of cross your fingers and hope that they don't come and destroy you. So the world at this point in time was just empires and empires in waiting. Just waiting for those large powers to like topple, and somebody else can come up and stab them in the back and rise in their place. So there was no real international community before this point. Whereas after the Second World War, we have the development of the UN and the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and all kinds of like international bodies which are trying to enforce a system of a rules-based environment upon the entire human civilization. So anyway, First World War, very interesting in like all of its complexity. But why on earth am I talking about it? Well, there's a wonderful author, he's probably my all-time favourite author, called Ian Banks. Unfortunately, he passed away recently. But Ian M. Banks also happened to write under the pseudonym Ian M. Banks. And Ian M. Banks was his like sci-fi counterpart. And he tended to write a lot about, nearly all of his sci-fi books, about this universe in which this society called the culture exists. And the culture effectively, like, it's a symbiotic society where you've got AI, godlike AIs, who inhabit giant space stations or giant spaceships, and then you've got human beings inside of them, and they kind of live together in this perfect utopia. But the point of the story is these guys are like at the top of the technological scale. There's no really much else they can go, or much else they can do from this. And in one of the books, Succession, where this quote comes from, basically the story is all about, they come across this weird black sphere which they can't determine what it is, and it's sitting next to a sun which just appeared out of nowhere, which is older than the universe itself. And they talk about this thing called the outside context problem. This idea of a problem that you'll face that you cannot address because you have no contextual understanding of it. So this is the way that Ian Banks put it. He said, it is an event that a civilization has no frame of reference to or previous understanding of, that most civilizations would encounter just once, and which they tended to encounter the same way a sentence encounters a full stop. In other words, they tend to get wiped out by these things. And here's the example that Ian Banks gives a little bit further on in the book, with his usual verve and wit. So it goes, the usual example given to illustrate the outside context problem was imagining that you were a tribe on the largest fertile island. You tamed the land, invented the wheel or writing or whatever, and the neighbours were cooperative or enslaved, but at any rate peaceful. And you were busy raising temples to yourself with all of the excess productive capacity you had. You were in a position of near absolute power and control, which your hallowed ancestors could have hardly dreamed of, and the whole situation was running along nicely like a canoe across wet grass, when suddenly this bristling lump of iron appears sailless and trailing steam in the bay, and these guys carrying funny-looking long sticks come ashore and announce, you've been discovered, and you're all subjects of the emperor now, and he's really keen on these presents called taxes. and these bright-eyed holy men want a word with your priests. Now, I think you can that example there is pretty demonstrative of what happened throughout the colonial period. You have much more technologically advanced and bureaucratically advanced. A lot of people discount that as so much, but you know, organisationally much more advanced countries coming into contact with other nations which are not, and of course the outcome of it was generally usually pretty awful. Just on a side note, the outside context problem came about because Ian M. Banks was addicted to civilization, and he eventually had to delete it off his hard drive because it got in the way of writing books. But it was the noticing when you're playing this game, every now and then you come across a nation that was much more advanced and much less advanced than you, and you kind of just, there's nothing that the lesser advanced nation can do. So anyway, let's have a look at a good example of this from real world history, and it'll be no surprise to see the Aztecs there. So when the Spanish conquistadors came into contact with the Aztecs were probably just on the cusp of the Bronze Age. So interestingly enough though, the main city, I can't even begin to pronounce it, but the main capital was one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world. It had one of the largest populations in the world. They were in many ways a very advanced civilization. If it hadn't been such a catastrophic first meeting between the Mesoamerican world and the Old World, I mean, who knows what it would have been today. The Mayans had this long history of scholarship, and they were just developing their own version of the alphabet. So who knows what would have happened. But anyway, long story short, Spanish conquistadors come ashore and they meet a bunch of local tribes, and a bunch of local tribes are like, hey, there's these dudes called the Aztecs, and they spend all of their time subjugating us and beating us, kidnapping all of our people and sacrificing them to their gods. And the Spanish was like, well, we've got all of these bunch of guns and we're wearing steel armour, and we'd kind of like to be a power in this part of the world. So they joined forces with the local tribes, they marched upon the Aztec Empire and laid siege to their capital. And, you know, it went pretty well. The Aztecs, they fought tooth and nail, and some of their weapons that they carried were really scary, did a whole bunch of damage. But it wasn't the Spanish themselves which managed to crush the Aztecs. It was the diseases which came with them. These guys, if you imagine it, like if we came across a modern, if you were a modern army and you come across like your enemy army, but the enemy army has, I don't know, they've got robot suits or something like that. You can still beat them, but they're going to be tough bastards to take down. That was George. And that's what the Spanish effectively acted like, this vast Mesoamerican army. They were like a central phalanx. So it wasn't the Spanish which brought the Aztecs low, it was smallpox. And about 2 years into the siege of the Aztecs' capital city, there's an outbreak of smallpox in the Spanish camp. But of course, Europeans by this time have dealt with smallpox for generations. And you know, we're not immune to it, but we're immune to many of the strains of smallpox. However, the Mesoamerican societies, who had lived in complete perfect isolation from all of the Eurasian diseases, had never come into contact with it before. And smallpox just burnt its way through the Aztec capital. In fact, smallpox and all kinds of hosts of other diseases burnt its way through the American continent. I mean, we're not quite sure how many people it killed. There's an estimate of maybe 40 million people it killed. But this is how the Mayans were taken out. The Mayans put up a hell of a good fight against the Spanish, and towards the end of their campaigns they were starting to force them out of their lands. But the diseases that had hit the Mayans, it decimated their military structure and their administrational structure till they weren't able to make effective fighting forces or effective decisions within their government. And by the time it was all over, by the time that, and take into account, there was entire sections of Mesoamerican society where there was 100% fatality rate. there's stories of explorers going through like Louisiana and just seeing the remains of just just towns and villages, just absolutely empty because everybody there had died. Think of every single plague in history that has hit the old world. So hit Africa, Asia, Europe. Imagine every single one of those diseases descending upon a group of people that have never come into contact with them before. I mean, apocalyptic is not the word. And in the aftermath, in the vacuum that came, the Spanish were the only standing power. They had better technology, they had better administrational power to be organised, and of course they also had a god which seemed to have spared these people. So that's why people flocked to them, and that's how the Spanish colonised the New World. So, that's what an outside context problem looks like in real life. There is no possible way to, well, it is nearly impossible to deal with it because just the forces are arrayed against you. I mean, if you're in the Aztecs position, how on earth do you solve that? I don't know. I don't know if it is feasibly if they could have. Anyway, so 10 years later, this gentleman, Dr. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, wrote this book called The Black Swan. And this was kind of what popularised the idea. Ian Banks came up with the idea first, but he popularised the idea. And so Nassim Taleb, he's a Lebanese national and became a stockbroker in the States and made a phenomenal amount of money. And the way that he made his money was by effectively by betting on very rare occurrences. He bet on stock market crashes, which come across only happen every now and then, but when they do, they have such huge implications that you can either lose a lot of money, or, if you're clever, you can make a lot of money. And that's how he made his cash. He did this. So he wrote this book, Black Swan. I mean, the book's all right. He spent a lot of time telling you exactly how fantastic he is. But in it, he describes the Black Swan in the following manner. He says, the event, so we're talking about an event, something that happens. He says, the event is a surprise to the subject of the event. The event has a dramatic impact. And after the event, people attempt to rationalise why they missed the signs for it. They attempt to synthesise and model how it could have been predicted. And later on in this lecture, I'll explain how our models that we use to predict the world can kind of backfire on us and cause us no end of problems. But but this is how he describes this thing that, you know, it comes on, it's just we've never seen it, we didn't see it coming, it causes huge damage, and then after it, well, you know, there's the recriminations. And think right now in the Democrat camp over in the States, they're already pointing fingers at the Democratic National Congress because they didn't nominate Bernie Sanders instead of Hillary. Who knows? That could have been a completely different race to the White House, but you know, it could have been. And the reason it's called a Black Swan event is because if you look back in European classical literature, all the way up through the Renaissance era, every time you talk about swans, swans are in poetry, they talk about swans as beautiful, these white, beautiful animals that fly through the air and stuff, and occasionally have a horrible mood. But of course, when ornithologists reach Australia, they suddenly discover black swans. So there always was black swans, and every single one of the pieces of these poetry that had ever been written was bollocks, because the black swan had always existed. We just weren't aware of the larger pattern. We weren't aware of the grander truth. And because we weren't aware of the grander truth, we weren't able to predict it. And so that's the black swan event in a nutshell. Right. Okay, and this is another way of describing black swan. So it's not just a novel event. We can also describe it in terms of magnitude. So here we go, here's normal distribution here, and standard deviation is just the average deviation a typical value has from our mean value here. So one standard deviation. So typically the way it goes is 68% of all of your data lives within one standard deviation, 95% of all data lives within 2 standard deviations, and then 99.7% of all data lives within 3 standard deviations. And that's the majority of our data, but you notice there's still 0.3% of the data out there, and this data lives there. That means there are still occurrences which live in both of these far extremities. But we don't account for them because they're so rare. And yet, if you think about it through history, the events which cause the biggest impact and really actually have changed things are these events that live in the outskirts, these outliers. We just don't prepare for them because they're so rare, but they still happen. So think of the Black Death. You know, there'll be plagues all the time killing a whole bunch of people, but nobody ever considered that a plague would come along that would have something like a 50% mortality rate. So, so we describe these as sigma values, so like 1 sigma, so that's 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma, which is just, you know, which is the same as 1 or 2 standard 3 deviations, and then the Black Swans live here. So let's have a look at an example of one. So here's the rainfall patterns in Cumbria, so from a single weather station from 1961 all the way up to 2016. So as you can see, so this is by frequency. So so we've had a whole bunch. So on average, it looks like that in Cumbria the rainfall level is going to be somewhere between like 25 and about 80 millimeters a month. That's your typical rainfall amount. But as you can see, if we draw the line over it, we've got this long tail here, and then we've got a few little events here, just single events, and then we've got this one right here, right in the outskirts, and that's the one that you want to be wary of because that's the scary one. That data's still there, which means it did happen, and of course that's the one that happened on Christmas 2015. That's the big storm that caused all the flooding. So, and let's have a look at another example. So this is Ebola outbreaks. I think I've shown this to you guys before, but here's Ebola outbreaks. So again, so a whole bunch of Ebola outbreaks, which just, you know, it's only ever happened once. But the majority of Ebola outbreaks historically tend to only kill between 10 to about 40 people. Which is, yeah, we think of Ebola as this terrifying thing, but it only tends to kill about 10 to 40 people. However, this is the chart that was taken prior to the 2014 Ebola outbreak. And as you can see, we've already got this long tail here. What we don't realise is that the long tail exists all the way up to 10,000 fatalities. So that, you know, the Ebola outbreak is a complete outlier and breaks the model that we're aware of with Ebola. And that's because, well, when we go into the lectures, maybe on epidemiology, I'll explain why that was the case. So here's another thing that he describes within the book. So he calls it the deluding fallacy. So humans are really good at spotting patterns. It's what's set us apart from a lot of the animals and allowed us to be so competitive, is that we can look into the environment and we can see patterns in the environment, so like tracks, maybe like you could spot the bark on a tree being missing. All of this is signs of predators and prey within your environment. But our pattern spotting capability exists much further out there. We can assign our pattern spotting capabilities into abstract concepts or into social concepts. We can draw conclusions from the world around them, and our conclusions that we draw aren't always correct. And this is what he calls it the ludic fallacy. This idea that, so ludic is effectively just means like, it's like just creating a narrative. So the idea is that we want to create a story and we want to create a model or a description of an event which makes sense. So that's why we create all of these data models. That's why people were assuming that Hillary was going to win because she kind of fitted the description of what a candidate needs to be to win the race to the White House. But you can be wrong, because as it says here, it's nearly impossible to always be in possession of all of the relevant data. There might be something missing, and it might just be a small little data point, but that data point could rapidly go out of control. Think of something like the chaos theory of like a butterfly flapping its wings. It could go rapidly out of control. Next thing you know, you've got a hurricane over the other side of the world. So there's also could be small variations within the data, which throw things dramatically outside of the assumed bounds. And models rarely, if ever, consider the impact of unprecedented events, like, as we're talking about today, as Black Swan events. We tend to consider that the world has constraints. We don't think about these rare things. And there is a whole bunch. Has anybody here seen the Long Short? Or The Big Short, sorry. It's quite a new film. So it's all about a group of like hedge fund managers who, prior to the big financial crash in 2008, saw it coming. And a few of the guys in there, they like Nassim Taleb, they base all of their financial models of making money on betting on rare events. And they saw this description of this and they're like, fucking hell, this is a chance to make huge amounts of cash, because they bet on it. They didn't have to bet a huge amount of money on it, but their returns were gigantic. So that's the deluding fallacy, and that's what makes us so vulnerable to so many events. It's because we assume things are going to happen in a certain way, and when shit goes awry, it's completely outside the boundaries of what we normally expect. I just realised I spelled fallacy with a V there, but never mind. So anyway, outside context problem, Black Swan events, they're all part of a greater philosophical problem called the problem of induction. So anyway, here's David Hume. He's one of the great philosophers in history. He's up there with people like Socrates and Descartes and Plato. He's the guy that gave us the concept of causality. So anyway, he talks about something called the problem of induction. And this is in, I think, I forget the name of the book he published. But anyway, he talks about the problem of induction thus. He says, when you make a general rule based on specific results, or where you forecast the future based upon the past. So effectively, what he is saying here, so in the first case he says, let's say we run 10 experiments on something, and in those 10 experiments it always returns the same result. So that means if you did an 11th experiment, you would expect it to be the same result. But you might be missing something here. There might be another factor in play which is exactly the same in all of the experiments you've done so far, which has given you that result, and you're missing just a fundamental variable which, if tweaked ever so slightly, completely changes everything. And or number two says, well, you forecast the future based upon the past. So, as I say, if you don't pay attention to history, you're doomed to repeat it. But think about the 2008 financial crash. People were making money hand over fist, and all they could see in the future was like, oh, this is great, we don't need to pay attention to people's credit ratings, this is fantastic. And because the times were so good, we kind of didn't consider that there could be something terrible just sitting in the horizon. We call that it's a bull market. Like it's this psychological reinforcement that because you're doing well, things are going to get better. So the example he gave is the sun. And let me ask everybody, is the sun going to raise in the sky tomorrow? Yeah, I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption. But are you sure? No. Because most people, if you say most people, the sun's going to rise tomorrow, they're like, yeah. And so you sure? They're like, yeah, of course. And of course it's going to rise tomorrow. But there's always a possibility there is our model of physics. Something about our model of physics is fundamentally wrong. And right now the sun's gone supernova, and we've got 2 minutes till it reaches it. And of course we're not going to notice it because supernova travels at the speed of light. So we're fucked. In 2 minutes' time we could all be dead. And it's just because we don't understand the overall pattern of how the laws of physics work. And so many years in the future, a chap called Bertrand Russell comes along. He was an English philosopher. He was a great proponent for a single world government and getting rid of nuclear weapons. And he described the problem of induction in the following terms. So he said, okay, let's say, Sam, you're a chicken, and I'm a farmer. And you arrive at the farm, and I'm like, hi chicken, have some food. And you're like, this is great. And you lay me an egg, and I was like, that's fantastic. And then tomorrow I come along and I give you some food, and you go, oh, that's fantastic. And you lay an egg, and you was like, this is quid pro quo, this is great. Let's say you've done this for 1,000 days. I come along, do you expect me to give you some food? Yes. Yeah. No, I'm coming to chop your head off and eat you. But of course, that's what the chicken expects, because that's all the chicken knows. As far as it's aware, it's in chicken utopia. In reality, it's part of a larger cycle of farmer eats your eggs, and then one day it's like, oh, I can do with a bit of roast. And that's it. Sorry, Sam, but that's the way it goes sometimes. And as David Hume says, the future has no obligation to mimic the past. So that's the problem with induction. That's the nub of what we're talking about. So, we can redefine the Black Swan event in the following way. So we say that the subject is a group of humans with finite resources and knowledge, because humans, as far as we are aware, all have finite resources and have limited knowledge. The problem is an occurrence which affects the subject and has the potential to cause disruption to the subject. So, every now and then, something out of the ordinary is going to happen and we deal with it. So not every unknown problem means something that we can't solve. But here we go, this is the third and most important part. The subject has no contextual understanding of part of all of the problem due to the fact that it's either a novel problem, that we've never seen it before, or that the magnitude of the problem is so great it completely dwarfs every single other example of it that we've got in history. Right, so let's jump forward. So, okay, so if we start thinking about actually defining these, describing these things. And you can do this for most big disasters out there. You can use this structure. So this structure was taken from, partially took from the Future of Humanities Institute. And they wrote this wonderful book called Existential Risks, which is basically about, it's global catastrophic risks. These are events quite similar to Black Swan events, which basically could just wipe out or cause huge problems for the human race as a whole. So, first of all, if we're going to describe a Black Swan event, we want to either consider whether it is an alien event or if it's an accession. An alien event is just a fact which is entirely novel. Well, that's why we call it alien. It's something completely unknown to us. So, in this case, gas attacks in the First World War. We never saw that coming, and the stories of the first gas attacks are absolutely horrific, and it took a long time for people to deal with the tactics, to understand how to deal with that. AI. If and when AI finally appears, oh my lordy, how are we going to deal with that? I've got no idea. They may turn out to be very nice and pleasant, or they could turn out to be barbarous, murderous killing machines. And gunpowder. Imagine you're the Aztecs, and you charge upon your enemy lines, and your enemy just seems to be standing there, pointing sticks at you, and you're like, oh, and next thing you know, everybody's dead. How do you deal with that? Across Eurasia, it took generations for them to develop the tactics to fight with gunpowder properly. But imagine you're on the Aztecs, and you've got 2 years to work it out. It's not going to happen. And then you've got accessions. These are things which happen on gigantic scales. The Black Death. Black Death, everybody had been hit with plague before, but anyway, it was basically the Mongols' fault, because disease is such, a war is such a wonderful vector for disease, especially when your agents carrying your disease are all on horseback, causing terrible misery across the world. Anyway, they get to the gates of one of the Genoan cities, where modern-day Ukraine, and all of a sudden they start getting hit by this horrible plague. So the Mongols were like, well, I don't know, let's just catapult all the dead over the walls. And they infected the Genoans, and the Genoans abandoned the city, got on all these boats, and had these stories like these Genoan death ships of appearing in harbours, and whoever went in there spread the plague and all kinds of stuff like that. So if you're known in those days and you try to see carbon, they'll burn you down. That's from the Japanese tsunami. So that tsunami was 9.5. 9.5 earthquake that caused that tsunami. No wonder it was so huge. And because it happened so close to the Japanese shoreline, they had pretty much zero response time. It just kind of happened and everybody had to run to the hills quickly. And that's why the majority of the fatalities in the Japanese tsunami were older people, because you had very little time to respond. It wasn't people stubbornly staying at home, it was people who couldn't run which got killed. And then finally, steel armour. So everybody's got armour. All the militaries in history make armour of some description or other. But imagine, again, you're an Aztec, and they did have some wickedly sharp weapons. They had weapons with like obsidian tips and stuff. Unfortunately, obsidian tips aren't very strong, and if you hit somebody in steel breastplate, your obsidian-tipped cattle, I think they were called, these giant weapons, it would shatter, and thus the dude in the steel armour with the steel sword goes ha ha ha, and he stabs you, and that's it, you're dead. And so we can figure the sources. So I mean, this is just fairly arbitrary, it's like breaking down, but we can use any way that we can break down. In the Future of Humanities Institute way, they just describe it as endogenous and exogenous. An endogenous event is simply anything by human activity, so war, terrorism, pollution, and an exogenous event is just something which is non-human, so Ebola, flooding, or volcanoes. You can break it down into all other kinds of ways. There's a lot, if you go to the business world when you're like doing risk analysis, you can use things like what they call PEST, which is political, environmental, social, or technological. I think that's probably a better way of doing it because it covers larger, more broader bases if we're talking about this stuff. But there's all kinds, there's like a bajillion different acronyms out there you can use. So it doesn't really matter on the source, but as long as you're describing the source. And epistemology. So, I don't know how many of you guys remember back to the Iraq War. You're probably youngsters. How old were you guys? It was like when 9/11 happened, youngsters? 6, 7? Dear God, I was at university. But anyway, so in the Iraq War in 2003, Donald Rumsfeld very famously went onto TV and somebody goes, Donald Rumsfeld, where are the weapons of mass destruction? And he goes on this long word-salady rant that makes no sense, talking about, it's like, well, there's these known knowns, and there's these known unknowns, and then there's these unknown unknowns. So, which he basically, his answer was basically, I don't know. And he was ridiculed for this speech, absolutely ridiculed. He even won an award for the foot and mouth and destruction of like the English language award. But a few years after, all of these philosophers started coming on and goes, my God, that man had brilliant insights. So in philosophy, we have this branch called epistemology, and epistemology is the way that we describe knowledge, how we describe a relationship with knowledge, so we know that something is real or something is false. And we break it down into this way. So he says, first of all, we've got these known knowns. And known knowns are stuff that we know. So that we know the Queen was called Elizabeth, we know we live on the planet Earth, and we know that Donald Trump won the presidential race. But we've got these known unknowns. So these are things that we know we do not know. So let's think. I can't, at the moment, tell you how many atoms are in my pen. I know it's made of atoms, and I know it's going to be a buttload, but I don't know how many atoms are living in my pen. Or if you're in the case of Donald Rumsfeld, well, he was certain, he knew there were weapons of mass destruction out there, but he did not know how many. I think it turned out there was something like 10. You know, it was a tiny proportion. Then there is also, I'll get this one in the end, but there's unknown unknowns. So stuff that we just don't know that we don't know. So we don't know that we don't know that there's an asteroid out there right now on a collision course with the planet. We don't know that we don't know that there is another financial crisis brewing somewhere because we don't know how it's going to come, when it's going to come, or what it's going to be like. And then finally we've got these unknown knowns, which is what we don't know we know. So that seems counterintuitive, but we don't know. So there's a wonderful, he's a Bulgarian philosopher, Zaslo Zizek. He's very fond of cocaine. If you watch any of the interviews with him, he's got a go. But he's quite a wonderful philosopher, and he describes this as our personal biases. These are prejudices, our our biases and prejudices, which force us to make incorrect conclusions around the world. So think of ideologies in particular. Ideologies force us to think in a certain way, and because an ideology kind of bounds your thinking, you can't think outside of the box, and therefore you can't consider there's a whole bunch of other variables out there. So, unknown knowns, stuff we don't know that we know. Okay, so now we can taxonomize the Black Swan events. Let's consider exactly where they come from. And at their core, they are born from uncertainty. So if a system is complex enough, or the variables are vague enough, then it's going to create chaos within a system, and these variables are going to interact with each other in interesting and strange ways, and ultimately it's going to bring a monster out of the system. So I think the best example of that is Elon Musk was talking about AI, and I think a lot of people are freaking out about AI. We don't know how or what it's going to finally be like. But he says, you know, if we create AI, because it is such an unknown variable, we could be summoning the devil. You know, we're creating this thing, and next thing we know, Skynet is raining down nukes upon us. So anyway, they tend to appear in three ways: unintended consequences, systemic risk, or biasing the system. And we'll look at each of those in turn. So this is just an example of how a complicated system can raise problems. So this has been referred to as the most complicated flowchart in human existence. And this is all of the various stakeholders in Afghanistan and trying to get peace within Afghanistan. And I'll be fucked if I know where to begin. Because there's so many interacting parts with each other and so many things that you have to balance with each other, you don't know if you interact with this section here, how that's going to knock on later down the line. So yeah, I mean, that's crazy. Okay, so unintended consequences. This is when we mess with systems and we don't realise the consequences. So there's these four things here that I want to look at here. So the first one is the Cobra effect. So the Cobra effect comes from, it's an anecdotal story from, I think it was from New Delhi in India during the British Raj in India. Anyway, so the local governor is wandering around New Delhi with his wife, and he sees a cobra. And he is horrified that there's cobras because there aren't cobras in England, damn it. So he is going to do something about that. So he goes to the colonial local office and he says, right, what we're going to do, we're going to put out a bounty for cobras. We're going to pay everybody a certain amount of money if they bring in a dead cobra, and then sooner or later we're going to kill off all of the cobras in the area and we won't have to get killed by snakes. And it works really well. In fact, it works so well that people start pouring in with all of these dead snakes. I mean, sometimes they're not cobras, but you know, whatever. And it's doing a really good job, and the population of cobras crashes dramatically. But then a weird thing starts happening. And so, if anybody can see through human nature here, what do you think started happening at this point in time?
People started breeding them.
People started breeding cobras. Exactly. There turned out to be an entire cottage industry on the outskirts of the city where people would be breeding cobras by the hundreds. And they would bring them in. And at first people were like, wow, there still must be loads of cobras in the city. And then they eventually got wind of this, and they closed down like the cobra bounty. So there you are, you're in charge of a cobra farm with hundreds, if not thousands of snakes, which are terrifyingly deadly, and there is no financial interest to kill them anymore. So I guess the safest thing to do is just let them free. So the cobra effect is an example when you implement a policy and you make the situation much worse, because by implementing the policy, by the people creating the cobra farms and therefore finally removing the incentive to kill them, they dramatically increased the population of cobras in the area. And this problem was repeated in Vietnam as well, in colonial French Vietnam, with rats in the city. And then we've got the blowback effect. So the blowback effect is, it's first referred to in terms in the 1950s. It was a term developed by the CIA. You can find the original paper where it is, and it's effectively when covert action goes horribly awry and comes back to, it comes back, and it's effectively it's reprisals against the person who conducted the covert action in the first place. So this case comes from went from the overthrow of, I forget who it was it Mossadegh? Yes, it was Mossadegh. So he was elected. He was elected by the Iranian people to be the democratically elected leader. The problem was that he was buddies with the Soviets, and he wasn't very friendly with the US. And by this time, the Iranians were already threatening to seize, to nationalise the oil, which BP had a stake in. So at that time, it was Anglo-Persian oil, I think it was. And the Americans weren't interested until the Soviets got involved, obviously. So they were like, right, and the CIA gets involved, and they cause a coup, and they reintroduce the Shah into Iran. And if you read the original paper from this, they say, be careful of blowback effect. We're dealing with such huge stakes here that if it goes wrong, the blowback from it could be catastrophic. And it turned out it was. 20 years later, Iranian revolution, and we now have a theocratic government in charge of Iran, which we are now only starting to form relations with. Hopefully, Donald Trump will realise that it's actually good to continue this foreign of relationships, because it's better to have friends than enemies in the world, but we will see. Then there's the Streisand effect, which I'm sure you're all youngsters, so you've probably heard the Streisand effect before. But it's when a group or an individual attempts to censor information or images, and it just catastrophically backfires on them, and that piece of information just disseminates itself through the entire internet, and everybody sees your dick pics. So the story comes from Barbara Streisand. So there used to be this, it's still around actually. There's this website which was conducted by, I think it was like the local geological survey in Beverly Hills. So Beverly Hills there's a bit along the river, and they were worried about erosion along this river face. So geologists go along the river, taking photos of all of the fronts of all of these houses which are on next to the river, and they were showing, and there you can see a bit of erosion there. So, and they put them up on a website for other sedimentologists to have a look at, so they could be, in case they were concerned about it, so to try and describe what was going on. It was mainly seen by 6 sedimentologists. In fact, that was the number of views of this image of Barbara Streisand's house on the riverfront. So she was horrified that people were seeing photos of their house online. That's 6 sedimentologists who probably couldn't give the slightest shit that her house was in there. All they were interested in was the sandstone beds underneath her house. But she was furious about this, and she took them to court, and she tried to sue them for millions, tens of millions. Eventually, the case was kicked out of court, and to spite her, the internet found out about this, and they spread her photo everywhere. And the photo's now been seen tens and tens and tens of millions of times, hundreds of million times probably, across the world, just to teach her a lesson, and that is the Streisand effect. And then finally, so we've got perverse incentives. So this is when this is like an economics term. So when you try and introduce an economic incentive to get your target audience to do a certain action, but it gets them to do something else. And I think the easiest one of that is banking fraud. So if we think we offer these bankers such gigantic bonuses that it's kind of tempting to maybe cut corners or to commit something that wasn't quite legit to make a bit more money. So think of the LIBOR scandal. You know, all of these people were effectively committing fraud, all of these banks, which they still haven't gone to jail over. I don't know. But yeah, it was because they gave them such insane incentives to make the money that they were like, well, screw it. If you think about it, so when I used to work for an old company, they implemented this policy that we had to have 40 face-to-face meetings with either clients or other people every month. And I said to my boss at the time, I said, the first thing that's going to happen is somebody's going to find a way around this. And within a week, I had one of my colleagues on the phone to me, and we were just chatting about whatever, and he goes, Ben, mark this down as a meeting. And I was like, what? He said, yeah, mark this down as a meeting. And I was like, yeah, okay. And I added that to my monthly total. And then there's another case, so there's a carbon credit. So carbon credits, the idea is that if you're a company and you implement a policy to reduce carbon outputs from your company, or you consume carbon in your company, you'll get so many carbon credits and you can exchange that for money. Oh, that took all of 5 minutes until various Russian companies were starting to abuse that. So there you go, unintended consequences, messing with a system when you don't realise what you're dealing with. And that's one of the big things. And there's Barbara Streisand's house. There you go. That'll teach you. Right, so the next thing we're going to go look at is systemic risk. So systemic risk, so it's like if you think of like vulnerability throughout networks. So next week we're going to be looking at networks in great detail. But so within a larger network, particularly, so think about the banking industry. The banking industry was using very similar models throughout the entire banking industry. And that's part of the reason why they were so screwed, because they're all doing the same thing. It's fine if you're all doing different things. But if you're doing the same things and you're hit by the same problem that you can't deal with, you're screwed. So think about recently the steel industry across the world is having huge problems because there's an economic slowdown in China. Because there's an economic slowdown in China, there is less demand for steel. And because there is less demand for steel, all the steel plants in China were like, well, we need to sell this steel to actually make a profit. So they just dumped it on the market at cheaper prices. That depressed the global price of steel, and that's what caused Port Talbot to close. And it's had huge repercussions across the world. And then you also got to consider that systems like ecosystems. But within ecosystems, there are going to be certain keystone features of that ecosystem which kind of hold it together. And if you remove that from the ecosystem, well, shit hits the fan. So there's a very famous case in the I think it was in the mid-90s. There's a Japanese company that made this resin. And this resin was used by every single computer manufacturer in the world to just stick computer components together. And it was a single Japanese company that did it. And of course that Japanese company gets hit by flooding and they go out of business. And so all of a sudden this trivial product becomes like this vital resource because nobody in the world is making it. And as a result, the cost of computers in the mid-90s just suddenly skyrocketed overnight. So, systemic risk. So, as I was saying, if we think of like networks as ecosystems and various things within ecosystems having vital keystone parts. So this is from a paper that was trying to remodel what happened in the 2008 financial crash. So he modelled the banking system as an ecosystem, as a network. And the idea is that in this network, as we'll find out next week, is that, particularly in real-world networks, you get this effect called what they call scale-free networks, where some nodes within the networks have dramatically larger amounts of connections than other nodes in the network. And that kind of follows a real world. So if you think about these are the banks in the middle, these are the big banks, these are the big boys, like HSBC and Lloyds. And then you've got all these smaller financial institutions linked directly to them. And these could just be like local energy brokers, they could be hedge funds, they could be insurance companies that are using are partially funded by the bank, and they're all linked to them. Anyway, so in this model, the idea is, so imagine this is our conceptual model for the bank. On that side, that's all the money that's coming into the bank. So this is like this deposits, where it's borrowing from other banks, and its personal value. And then the stuff going out is its loans and its constant assets that it's going to be selling off. And then the idea is that you hit one of the banks somewhere in the network with a financial shock. So you reduce this total amount, or you increase the total amount of outgoings. And if the total amount of